Yeah, thank you, Gael. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here because usually I am more of a policy person, and actually we are based in Brussels. So for me, it was literally the 100 meters that I had to go to come here. But I'm very happy that people are still able to travel and actually participate in some meetings. So this is great. And today, what I want to talk about is mostly our study on the impact of open source software and hardware. Um, we did take a look at AI as a part of this study, but it's almost 400 pages of economic impact and policy analysis of open source policies nationally in different member states in Europe, but also outside of Europe, as well as European policies. Um, but maybe first thing first, what is Open Forum Europe? Open Forum Europe is a Brussels-based, as I said, think tank that is working on openness in digital, and we work on many different topics. They include open source software, hardware, as I said, but also cloud computing, also digital government. Let me show you some of the, I have it on this slide. We do some things on public procurement, also on internet policy quite broadly. Um, so many subjects, and actually with every year, there are more and more digital policy files that we are working on. And open source is a big part of it, and I would say even a heart of it, because we see it as open source is often actually not mentioned and not included in many policy files. And our goal is actually to have these discussions and actually to put open source as a part of it. Um, so yes, let's go slowly to the study. But first, I would like to talk a bit about how open source is perceived in policy. So we are an organization that focuses on this, but we are actually alone in that. There are many digital associations, but they're often representing particular industries or particular technologies. Um, and we are not. We are talking to people, and our work is based a lot on talking to different stakeholders, and these stakeholders can include, yeah, meetups like this, foundations. It can include the European Commission, the European Parliament, also developers themselves, small and medium-sized companies, big companies. So there are many actors in the ecosystem that we need to talk to and just ask them, okay, so you do open source or want to do it, why and how you would like to achieve it, and how we can make it happen with some high top level political support. But the question is, in this room, I'm pretty sure that we all know this, that open source is everywhere. Basically, if you start any digitally adjusted, digitally connected project or any software project, you need some kind of open source. You do it. But actually, not all of the politicians know it. And for example, in policies that are coming out, in industrial policies, open source is not mentioned at all or not even looked at. There are some that actually take a closer look at it, and that's included. But yeah, here that's the industrial policy, and it doesn't really mention open source. It does mention standardization, which is another topic that we work on a lot, and we see it as very complementary to open source. Um, but the AI Act is not really mentioning open source at all, and there are many different reasons for it. The main one is actually lack of research that is dedicated on this. I'm going to talk about it a bit more, but it seems that it's changing because we talk a lot about openness, about digital sovereignty or technological independence. And these topics are starting to go throughout sectors and industries. Uh, oh yeah, I also wanted to mention the high-level expert group that has been convened at the European Commission. So in the main guidelines of the expert group, there was not really a mention of open source. But then the recommendations were actually recommending to invest more in open source that is used in different AI projects. So we were pretty happy to see this and to see it included in a different file. But the question is, why? Why is that? Because policymakers know a lot about many subjects, and why is this one sort of niche? Um, so the big part is that there is a lack of cross-sectoral research. And actually, the research that I'm going to talk about is the first one that has been done since 2006 on the European level. So in 15 years, a lot happened in the ecosystem throughout all of the industries. Um, but in order to develop and implement policies that are actually beneficial in supporting open source in some way, we need evidence. Policymakers need numbers. They need, I don't know, number of jobs that can be created. They need the value that it contributes to the GDP. And they need the economic incentive and also the incentive for the citizens that they serve. That it makes sense. Yes, let's do it. Let's support it. Let's have it on the top political level. So, I mean, of course, our research is not providing all the answers, but we tried to, conclude them in a way that actually shows if and why it makes sense. And yes, we did find out that it does make sense. So if you would like to access the study, here's a QR code. I believe it works. There is a too long didn't read version because the report is almost 400 pages long. There's also an executive summary, and it's much more digestible. But yeah, if you want to know any details, please feel free to go there. I see that some people are still looking, so I'm going to start to talk about who conducted the study and why. So the study was mostly conducted by us, OpenForum Europe, and Fraunhofer ISI. And there we had a great economist, Professor Knut Blind from the Technical University of Berlin. So he did the whole economic analysis. And whenever I talk about the economic analysis, it was done on data from 2018 and mostly based on GitHub Data as the largest data set that we could use to see open source contributions, to see who are the people who are contributing, what are the companies that are contributing. And even procuring this study means that the European Commission is interested in this and that this institution is interested in supporting openness and transparency and researching why it would make sense for us. So a very quick overview of the task that we tried to achieve. So the biggest one was the economic impact of open source software and hardware. And I have to warn you that unfortunately, we're not able to conduct a full analysis of the economic impact of open source hardware. It's still not mature enough in a way, and there is not enough data that we were able to use. So in this part, we focused on software, but we would be very keen to discover a bit more about hardware because it is a topic of a growing importance, and there are more people that are doing this and talking about it. The second part was how open source is used in the private and public sector, and what are the public policies that are supporting it, and what impact such policies had on economies of given countries, but also on public administrations. We had it quite in separate parts, but I'm going to talk about it soon. So first, the hard numbers. These are pretty interesting numbers. I'm not an economist myself, so I try to summarize it in the best way possible. Um, so as you see here, investment in open source is huge. 8.2% of the 3 million employees in computer programming contribute to GitHub, at least, because this is only GitHub data. Of course, there are other data sources that could be used. We, supported the study with many different data sets, but this is what we got from GitHub. And there's over 30 million commits to GitHub yearly, which is an effort of over 6,000 full-time equivalents. 1 billion euros personal cost investment was made in 2018. And actually, the interesting point is that small companies are the most active. So 75% have less than 100 employees among the most active contributors. So the smaller the company, the more commits. But of course, then we have large companies that, based on their sheer size, are contributing more, but also on the institutional setups that they have. So they have more money and more resources to put into, actually creating this sort of infrastructure within a company to set up an OSPO, and interact with the communities to actually, have this work as a sustainable and a long-lived work. And the contribution of open source in the EU economy in 2018 was between 65 billion and 95 billion euros. So this is huge, and this is the lower bound. It might be much higher, and we are very keen to check it, in a couple of years and just see how this is rising. But This is about half to 0.7% of European Union's GDP. And it means that open source contributes similar value to European GDP annually as both air and water transport combined. So this was a revelation for us. I mean, of course we looked at so much data, and we did both the qualitative and quantitative analysis. And this number, I mean, this just really shows that it makes sense for the policymakers to actually know what open source is. Um, Another piece of data that I wanted to share is that the cost benefit ratio is 1 to 4. So €1 put into an open source project results in €4 of benefits. Of course, this is quite a global benefit, and also we have to remember that open source is global and cross-border in its nature. So it's not that easy to have an analysis on the member state level. That's why European Union is a good data source, because it's a bit more global. Um, so now let's jump to the public policy analysis. Um, so our goal was to see, I mean, first we created a framework to see what policies exist there, but also in which policies open source should be included. We took a look at several countries and did a comparison, and then we tried to understand why governments engage with open source and what makes it work or not. And this is actually quite interesting results in there. Um, so it's important to ensure that the policy analysis that we do is structured. It's very difficult to compare different countries because each is doing absolutely a different thing. But we found two dimensions that work. So the first one is the public policies that are directed at the public sector, and the second one is the public policies that are directed at the private sector. You can see the questions here. I'm not going to go very much in detail into this. But this was a pretty interesting result. You are going to see why. Here you can see the countries that we took a look at. So in Europe, it was Bulgaria, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and UK. It was in 2018. Brazil, the United States, China, India, Japan, and South Korea. And there is a big regional difference in all of these countries, and also within the European Union. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 case studies just to show you how different this involvement is and what it can mean for all the different sectors where open source can be applied. So in Brazil, we saw a big push for open source in the early 2000s, and it actually came from a very activist independency point of view. So what was seen as such was that open source gives us digital autonomy, that we can support our own Brazilian sector, and that institutionalization is a part of the effort, but it was not really taken up on the highest level of government. And around 2010, it started to just, fly away, and the initiative was not there anymore. And we actually saw it in many countries that we have the open source champions. So if there is 1, 2, maybe 5 open source champions in the government, but it's not institutionalized, then when I don't know they change a job, or they're just, no, I quit, then it's over. And usually this push for open source within the government is over as well. And right now, actually, there is not much support, not much discussion on the political level about open source in Brazil. Okay. Now let's jump to Europe, to Italy. There is a very interesting study done by a Harvard Business School professor, Frank Nagel, that we worked with as well for the study, who took a look at Italy and France. And he compared, because both of these countries introduced policies that basically said that the public sector should favor open source while doing public procurement. And in France, it worked quite well. And I know that many of you are coming from France. So, I mean, there is a strong open source spirit in France as such. And in Italy, they introduced this legislation, but nothing happened. Nobody was implementing this. And the reason why is that in local offices, in local administrations of a city, I don't know, of Milan or wherever, people didn't know how to implement this. You had a paragraph of law that was saying that you should favor open source, And a person procuring software for the local office was like, what does it mean? I don't know. What are these licenses? Like, I mean, it's much easier to use proprietary software. Um, so it shows that, there was no guidance for the officers how to do this. And it's actually quite the case in the European Union. Bulgaria is another country that actually had a law in 2016 that mandated using open source within governments. There are even fines that are introduced, but of course, no fine was given. A person that introduced or pushed for the law within the government quit their job in 2017, so it just hasn't been taken up. And let's go to South Korea because that's a very different example. So South Korea didn't really focus on the public sector, but they focused on the private sector throughout the years, and it's been years and years. Um, so the idea was that they want their industry to be strong, and they saw that open source is a chance for the industry to grow. So they actually put a lot of money and a lot of resources into supporting the private sector in their open source. So as you see, there is a Korea Copyright Commission that focused on license compliance, and it was $3 million per year that was dedicated to the goal. Open Source Software Competence Plaza, and this was $12 million. Cost Lab, that was an open source incubator, and a national IT promotion agency that also cared a lot about open source, had $360 million budget per year. And this is unheard of in the European Union. They put a lot of resources, and actually the private sector is quite strong when it comes to open source. So I talked about the framework, the public sector, the public sector or the private sector. And we gave it so yeah, the three countries that I just talked about are here. And we see the private sector dimension and the public sector dimension. And what we see in Italy is actually usually the case in the European Union, and this is usually the case in Asia. So the conclusion that we got from it was that, and it's actually not only for open source policies, it's for any digital policies, it's that writing a good law is not everything. I mean, it doesn't work if there is no guidance, if there is no culture, and if there is no uptake, among the people who are actually doing the thing. So what we also came up with policy recommendations that I'm going to go through in a bit. But it's very difficult to interest somebody, whether a public official or a company, to do something that they don't want to do. So it's often the case, we have to make it fun. We have to make it sound like, yes, a good investment, because it is, but many people don't know it. So, but when trying to attack the level of prescriptiveness of the legislation, it's not that important. What we have found is much more important to have this openness culture, which can go through many different parts of the organization. And it's not only open source software, but it's also open data, open innovation, open science activities. And all of these activities can contribute to governments, and also governments that are more open and transparent, but also industries and private companies that are stronger and can actually grow in a sustainable and collaborative and open way. So we really see political support as necessary, but it doesn't always have to go from top down. It can go from top. So, I mean, as a summary, there are changing stories and motivations. But the issue is a bit larger than just writing a law or a particular policy. There is a big geographical spread, and also it's this thing that governments take inspiration from other governments. So also institutions, there is one international institution that sees another institution that is doing open source or is setting up an open source program office, and they're like, yeah, maybe we should do it as well. So it's not as simple as having a law. And I want to go a bit into the AI aspect that we took a look at. And actually, while conducting this study, we saw that there is not that much that is written about AI and open source and public policies, which is very weird because there is a huge focus on AI in Brussels, and there are so many digital files that mention this, so many goals that mention AI or fully focus on this. But open source is not usually the part of the conversation. And our idea is that we talk a lot about cybersecurity. We talk a lot about high performance computing or quantum computing as well. We talk about digital sovereignty. We talk about sustainability of technology. And open source should be a part of all of these conversations. Because it also touches so many different industries and so many sectors that we have to at least know what is its role and if it makes sense to support it in some way and if governments can support it. Here is a graph that I took from a study from OECD from 2020, and it actually shows commits to AI software versus all the software, and it's based on GitHub data as well as our study. So you see that the difference is huge, and it started to change around 2013. So to us, it seems that there is a need to research the issue a bit more. And actually, the most commonly used programming language that was indicated in the study was Python, and most of the projects had some AI element to them. There is an interesting report from the done for the AIDA committee at the European Parliament that is called Challenges and Limits of an Open Source Approach to Artificial Intelligence. I was very happy to see this report because it was much needed. And it actually came up with a set of recommendations that I would like to take a look at. So the first one is more research, which I am fully on board with, and also economic research done on costs and benefits of using open source AI in public administrations in the EU. I would add that also in the private sector. Promoting GovTech and civic tech ecosystems, incentivize open source collaborators and SMEs to increase transparency of their software, facilitating good data access for public institutions. So here there are many different initiatives that can serve for the purpose. Supporting public sector as potential producer of open source AI and using public procurement as a way of also using it. Strengthening sharing of open source data and analytical tools across communities of research and practice. And yeah, I believe we will have a talk about this a bit later, so that will be very interesting. I would like to quickly go through the policy recommendations that we have developed for our study, which are a bit more overarching. So we have three categories that we separated the recommendations to. The first one is a digitally autonomous public sector. The second one is about R&D that is enabling European growth. And the third one is a digitized and internationally competitive industry. So we have some subcategories that you can take a look at. And AI, HPC, and software-defined infrastructure was one of the sub-chapters that we used. So the main recommendation when it comes to the public sector is setting up open source program offices. And we see it happening right now in many governments, and both on the member state level and in the international level in international bodies. We see it as a way to interface with open source communities, and whether it's a community that is focusing, I don't know, on sustainability or on AI or on cloud computing, it's still worth to have an OSPO that can interact and understand what is happening and how to use it within the institution. And it is a very exciting time when it comes to OSPOs. I guess many of you quite know it. The recommendations for research are mostly funding, and investing in open source private and public sector development. We have shown that it brings results, and the results are quite global, but it doesn't mean that the more local entities are not benefiting from it as well. Another one, a big one, is education and skills, because open source is very often not included in curricula, and I'm not only talking about IT programs or programming courses, because no, I mean the point is to introduce more of the open culture and open perspective of whatever a government is doing or a company is doing. And the last one is the industrial sector, and it's again financing. So financing high-risk R&D intensive open source-based startups, as we saw, small companies are contributing a lot. Integrating open source into IP and procurement regulation, and embracing open source hardware as well, because this is really emerging, and we are going to see quite some growth. I know that the Eclipse Foundation is doing a lot of good things on open source hardware. And realizing potential of open source reuse and repairability for reducing carbon footprint. So what are the AI specific recommendations? I have to say we would really like to go a bit deeper into the topic, because some new papers and analyses are coming up, and I know that there will be some researchers that are going to work on AI and open source in terms of public policy starting in January. So I mean, we hope to have some more exchanges on this. So of course, the first one is providing funding opportunities for open source companies and developers for AI specific projects. Clarifying legal framework and IP issues, because as we know, in any digital sector, when the legal framework is not really clear, we do not really know how to operate, and the innovation is not having its way as much as it could. And the main one, researching the issue more, also outside of ethical concern scope, because there are over 100, 150 different ethical guidelines on AI that are being produced by different governments, by different research institutes, academics, and they are very much needed. I fully agree, but we also have to look at this not in terms of risks and how to protect ourselves from high risk or low risk, doesn't matter, AI solutions, but we also have to see the benefits. And looking at the issue a bit more from the open source perspective, I believe would lead us to a bit more of a positive view on this. So yeah, that was it. If you would like to learn a bit more about OpenForum Europe, here is our website and Twitter. Also, if you want to contact me, my email is Paula at OpenForum Europe. You don't have to write my last name, so that's much easier. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer if you have time.